History as we know it is supposed to be continuous. One civilization builds upon the ruins of another. Knowledge accumulates. Progress marches forward. We learn to farm. Then we build cities. Then we invent writing. Then we create empires. A nice neat line from primitive to advanced, from cave paintings to cathedrals to skyscrapers. Except that's not what actually happened. If you look closely at the historical record, really examine the evidence we have, you'll find something unsettling. There are gaps. Enormous, unexplained gaps. Centuries where thriving civilizations simply vanish from the archaeological record. Periods where human progress doesn't just slow down, it stops completely. Sometimes it even goes backward. Advanced societies collapse overnight, and their descendants spend generations living in the ruins, unable to understand the technology their ancestors used. These aren't just missing pages in a history book. These are entire chapters torn out. Whole epochs where we simply don't know what happened to millions of people. Where were they? What were they doing? How did they survive? And most disturbingly, why did so many of them fail to survive at all? The Bronze Age kingdoms of the Mediterranean didn't gradually decline. They disappeared within a single generation. The Western Roman Empire fell, and Europe plunged into centuries where people forgot how to build in stone. Entire cities in the Americas were abandoned, swallowed by jungle, their inhabitants scattering to places unknown. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world, vanished so completely that we still can't read their writing 4,500 years later. These are the shadows between history, the dark spaces where our timeline breaks down and the story stops making sense. Now, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing Berlin at breakfast and Boston at bedtime. All at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries. Here's what makes these gaps so compelling. We have physical evidence that these civilizations existed. We can see their ruins, their artifacts, sometimes even their mummified remains. But then suddenly the evidence just stops. It's like finding someone's diary with 50 pages ripped out right in the middle of the most important chapter. Take the archaeological record of the late Bronze Age. For centuries we see evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated writing systems, diplomatic correspondence between kingdoms. Then around 1200 BCE, almost all of it vanishes, not just in one place. In dozens of places simultaneously across the Mediterranean and Near East. Cities burned, trade routes abandoned, writing systems forgotten. For the next 400 years, the historical record is almost completely dark. Or consider pre-Dynastic Egypt. We know the Great Pyramids were built around 2500 BCE. But the civilization that built them must have spent centuries developing the knowledge, the mathematics, the organizational skills required for such monuments. Yet when we look for evidence of that development period, we find almost nothing. It's as if the Egyptians went from small farming villages to perfectly engineered megastructures with barely any transition. These gaps aren't just puzzling, they're haunting, because they remind us how fragile our own civilization might be. How quickly knowledge can be lost, how easily complexity can collapse into chaos, how close we always are to forgetting everything we think we know. Tonight we're going to explore these shadows, the centuries that swallowed civilizations whole. We'll travel from the Eastern Mediterranean during its mysterious collapse to the European Dark Ages, where literacy itself nearly died out. We'll venture into the pre-Columbian Americas, where entire cultures rose and fell without leaving written records. We'll examine the Indus Valley, where a civilization of millions left behind cities but no explanations. We'll trace the lost history of Sub-Saharan Africa, deliberately erased by those who came later. We'll follow the Pacific navigators who colonized thousands of islands, then vanished into oral tradition. We'll peer into the murky centuries before ancient Egypt became Egypt. And we'll end at the younger Dryas, 12,000 years ago, when global catastrophe may have erased civilizations we'll never know existed. There's something deeply calming about these mysteries. Unlike the chaos of current events, these puzzles have been waiting for thousands of years. They'll still be waiting tomorrow. There's no urgency, no deadline, just the quiet comfort of knowing that history is far stranger and more incomplete than we usually admit. So get comfortable, let the questions wash over you, and let's step together into the shadows between history, where entire civilizations wait in the darkness, hoping someone will remember they were here. Picture this: the Eastern Mediterranean in 1225 BCE. This was the peak of human civilization, the most interconnected, sophisticated, complex world humanity had ever created. The Egyptian New Kingdom ruled the Nile with monuments that would still be standing 3,000 years later. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia with ironclad armies and bureaucratic precision. Mycenaean Greece flourished with palaces full of gold and warriors whose legends would echo through Homer's epics. The Minoans traded from their island paradise of Crete. The Canaanites and their Phoenician descendants sailed the Mediterranean, connecting all these civilizations through networks of trade that stretched from Afghanistan to Spain. Cities like Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae and Pylos were metropolises by ancient standards, some housing tens of thousands of people. They had sophisticated writing systems, complex administrative bureaucracies, specialized craftsmen, professional armies. They traded tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa. Their ships carried wine, olive oil, textiles, perfumes, weapons. Their diplomatic correspondence, written in Akkadian, the English of the Bronze Age world, shows a level of international relations that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. And then, in the span of maybe 50 years between 1200 and 1150 BCE, all of it collapsed. Not declined, not gradually transformed. Collapsed. Cities burned. Palaces were abandoned. Trade networks shattered. Writing systems disappeared. Populations plummeted. The sophisticated international world of the late Bronze Age simply ceased to exist. This wasn't like the fall of Rome, which took centuries and left behind successor kingdoms that preserved elements of Roman culture. This was abrupt, catastrophic, and nearly universal across the Eastern Mediterranean. Within a single human lifetime, civilization went dark, and it stayed dark for 400 years. Here's what the archaeological record shows, and it's disturbing. Layer after layer of destruction across dozens of sites. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, burned so hot that limestone walls vitrified. The palace at Pylos in Greece shows evidence of desperate fortification efforts just before it was destroyed. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, was so thoroughly demolished that it was never rebuilt. The palace at Knossos in Crete, center of Minoan civilization, abandoned. Troy, Levallois, destroyed. Megiddo in Canaan, destroyed. Hazor, destroyed. Ashkelon, destroyed. The list goes on. More than 40 major settlements show evidence of violent destruction during this period, not spread out over centuries, concentrated in just a few decades around 1200 BCE. Something catastrophic swept through the Bronze Age world like a tsunami, smashing everything in its path. But here's what's really disturbing. We don't know what did it, or more accurately, we have too many explanations and not enough evidence to choose between them. Because the Bronze Age collapse didn't just destroy cities, it destroyed the ability to record what happened. When writing systems disappeared, so did the historical accounts that could have told us what went wrong. The most famous theory involves the Sea Peoples. They appear in Egyptian records around 1200 BCE as a confederation of raiders and invaders coming from the islands in the midst of the sea. Pharaoh Ramesses III, fought them in a massive naval battle around 1175 BCE and claimed victory, but even Egypt was weakened. His temple inscriptions described them as a terrifying force that had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and multiple other kingdoms before reaching Egypt's borders. But who were the Sea Peoples? The Egyptian records list names: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Danyan, the Weshesh. Some scholars think the Peliset became the Philistines. Maybe the Shekelesh were Sicilians. The Danyan might have been Danaans, the Greeks mentioned in Homer. But these are guesses based on similarities in names written in hieroglyphs 3,200 years ago. We don't know where they came from, what language they spoke, or even if they were a unified group, or just a convenient Egyptian label for those barbarian raiders from the north. More troubling still, we don't know if they caused the collapse or were a symptom of it. Because here's the thing about the Sea Peoples. They appear in the records after many of the major destructions. Hattusa burned before Rameses III fought his great sea battle. The Mycenaean palaces were already destroyed or abandoned. So were the Sea Peoples destroying civilizations, or were they refugees from civilizations that had already collapsed for other reasons, desperately seeking new homes in a world falling apart? Some archaeologists think climate change was the real culprit. Paleoclimate data show significant drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Tree ring studies from ancient timber show reduced growth. Pollen records indicate decreased rainfall. Lake levels dropped across the region. For Bronze Age civilizations that depended on agriculture to feed dense urban populations, sustained drought could have been catastrophic. Crop failures would have led to famine. Famine would have caused social unrest. Desperate populations might have become raiders. Trade networks that depended on surplus production would have broken down. This makes sense, until you realize that Bronze Age civilizations had dealt with droughts before. Egypt in particular had sophisticated systems for managing Nile floods and dealing with lean years. The theory of climate change as the sole cause doesn't explain the sheer speed and thoroughness of the collapse. Droughts cause gradual decline, not the sudden destruction layers we see in the archaeological record. Others point to systems collapse. The Bronze Age world was extraordinarily interconnected. Those trade networks that seemed like such strengths were also vulnerabilities. When you need tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus to make bronze weapons and tools, you're dependent on stable trade routes across thousands of miles. When you've specialized your economy to produce wine and olive oil for export, you need to import grain. When your palace bureaucracy has grown so complex that it takes dozens of scribes just to track inventory, you're vulnerable to disruption. Think of it like a house of cards. Each civilization was supporting the others through trade, diplomatic marriages, military alliances. The whole structure was stable as long as every piece stayed in place. But if something knocked out one major player, the cascading effects could be devastating. If the Hittites fell, their trading partners lost access to critical resources. If trade routes became unsafe due to raiders, specialized economies collapsed. If one civilization's collapse sent refugees flooding into neighboring regions, it could destabilize them too. The complexity that had made Bronze Age civilization so impressive also made it incredibly fragile. The evidence for systems collapse is compelling. We can see it in the administrative records. The Linear B tablets from Mycenaean Greece, baked in the fires that destroyed the palaces, show bureaucracies frantically trying to manage resources in what appear to be crisis conditions. Allocations of bronze are measured to the gram. Conscriptions of rowers for ships suggest military emergencies. The last tablets from Pylos mention coastal watchers, as if they were expecting an attack from the sea. But then the tablets stop. Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared completely. It wouldn't be redeciphered until 1952. For 400 years Greece had no writing system at all. The sophistication of palace administration, the careful record-keeping, the complex logistics that supported Mycenaean civilization, all gone, and not just gone temporarily. Gone so thoroughly that later Greeks had no memory that writing had even existed. When the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet centuries later, they had to start from scratch. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so terrifying. It wasn't just political change. It was cultural regression on a massive scale. Population levels plummeted. Some estimates suggest Greece lost 80% of its population between 1200 and 1000 BCE. People abandoned cities and returned to small agricultural villages. Monumental architecture stopped. Pottery styles became simpler. Metallurgy techniques were lost. International trade ceased almost entirely. The world got smaller. The cosmopolitan Bronze Age civilization that had connected 3 continents was replaced by isolated villages that barely knew what existed beyond the next valley. The historical record shows this isolation. Egyptian pharaohs who had once corresponded with kings across the known world now dealt only with local concerns. The great diplomatic archives, like the Amarna letters that show the Bronze Age world at its peak, have no equivalent after 1200 BCE, because there was no one left to write to. What's haunting is what was lost forever. We'll never know most of what Bronze Age civilization achieved, because the collapse destroyed not just the civilizations themselves, but the records of their accomplishments. Libraries burned. Oral traditions were disrupted when populations scattered. Technologies were forgotten when the specialists who knew them died without passing on their knowledge. Consider writing, the Linear A script of the Minoans, still undeciphered. The Luvian hieroglyphs of Anatolia, barely understood. Whatever writing systems existed in Mycenaean outposts around the Mediterranean, lost. Even in places where writing survived, like Egypt, the collapse created gaps. Egyptian chronology becomes fuzzy, the historical records are incomplete. We're missing pieces of the story that would help us understand what happened, and the collapse wasn't uniform. Some regions suffered more than others. Cyprus was devastated but recovered relatively quickly. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast survived and even prospered, eventually expanding their trade networks westward to found Carthage. Egypt survived, though weakened, but the Hittite Empire disappeared entirely. Mycenaean civilization ended. The great cities of the Syrian coast were destroyed. For these regions, the Bronze Age didn't just end, it was erased so thoroughly that its very existence became legendary. The recovery, when it finally came, took centuries. Greece remained in its dark age until around 800 BCE, when writing was reintroduced and population began to grow again. But the classical Greek civilization that emerged was fundamentally different from the Mycenaean civilization that preceded it. Different political systems, different religious practices, different economic organization. The Bronze Age palace economies, with their centralized control and bureaucratic complexity, were replaced by smaller city-states. The great palaces were remembered only in legends about Agamemnon and the Trojan War, stories that later Greeks thought might be pure fiction, until archaeologists discovered that Troy and Mycenaean were real places. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so relevant today is how modern our Bronze Age predecessors were in some ways. They lived in an interconnected global economy. They dealt with international diplomacy and trade disputes. They managed complex supply chains. They built civilizations that seemed permanent, that had lasted for centuries. And then it all fell apart so quickly that the survivors couldn't fully explain what had happened. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We still don't know the primary cause. Was it the sea peoples, climate change, systems collapse, earthquake storms, new weapons technology that made the old military systems obsolete? A combination of all these factors. The academic debates continue because the evidence is ambiguous. Different regions show different patterns of destruction and abandonment. Some sites show evidence of earthquake damage. Others were clearly burned in military attacks. Still others seem to have been abandoned without violence, as if the population simply left. What we do know is that when multiple stresses hit simultaneously, even sophisticated civilizations can fail catastrophically. The Bronze Age world might have survived drought, or raiders, or political instability, but all of them together, cascading through interconnected systems, were too much. The House of Cards collapsed, and when it did, humanity lost 400 years, 4 centuries during which populations declined, technologies were forgotten, writing disappeared, trade networks shattered. 4 centuries of regression during which the descendants of Bronze Age civilizations struggled to survive in a darker, smaller, more dangerous world. 4 centuries of history that left almost no written record, just destruction layers in the archaeological evidence and legends passed down through oral tradition. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that civilization is more fragile than we think. That complexity creates vulnerability as well as strength. That the sophisticated systems we build to connect us can also cascade our failures, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts to record and preserve, whole eras of human achievement can simply vanish, leaving only ruins and mysteries for future generations to puzzle over. When the lights came back on, when Greece emerged from its dark age and writing returned and civilization rebuilt itself, the world was fundamentally changed. The Bronze Age was gone, and with it went knowledge, technologies, and historical records we'll never recover. Somewhere in those lost centuries lies answers to questions we can't even formulate anymore. Stories that will never be told, achievements that will never be celebrated, all gone dark in the span of a single human lifetime, lost in the shadows between history. Picture this. Rome 476 CE, the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen, simply stops, not with a bang, not with some apocalyptic battle, but with a whimper. The last Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, is pensioned off by a Germanic general, and just like that, 5 centuries of Roman dominance come to an end. But here's what makes this moment so strange. The cities are still standing, the roads are still there, stretching across Europe like a massive stone spiderweb. The aqueducts still carry water. The libraries still hold thousands of scrolls. Everything is there except the people who knew how to maintain it all, except the bureaucracy that held it together, except the literate class that could read the instructions. Within a generation, maybe 2, it all starts falling apart. Not destroyed, just abandoned, forgotten. And for the next 500 to 600 years, Europe plunges into what we've come to call the Dark Ages. Except nobody at the time called it that. Nobody knew they were living in a dark age. They were just trying to survive. Now here's the thing about the Dark Ages. The name itself is controversial. Modern historians hate it. They prefer early medieval period or late antiquity, and they have a point. The term Dark Ages was invented by Renaissance scholars who looked back at this period and saw nothing but ignorance and barbarism. They were comparing it to Rome at its height and finding it wanting, but that comparison isn't fair. It's like judging a forest that's regrowing after a wildfire and calling it dark because it's not as tall as it used to be. But there's another reason the term fits, a reason that has nothing to do with judgment. These centuries are literally dark to us. We can barely see into them. The written record doesn't just decline, it almost vanishes. In some regions we go from hundreds of documents per decade to maybe 1 or 2 per century. Archaeological evidence becomes sparse and ambiguous. The material culture becomes so simplified that it's hard to date sites accurately. We're not just looking at a period of decline, we're looking at a period where our ability to see what was happening almost completely breaks down. It's like someone turned off the lights in history's archive. So what actually happened? How does the most documented, most bureaucratic, most literate civilization in the Western world simply forget how to read and write within a few generations? The short answer is that the infrastructure of literacy collapsed. But the long answer is so much more interesting and so much more terrifying. Rome wasn't just an empire, it was a machine, a vast interconnected system where every part depended on every other part. The cities depended on grain from North Africa, the army depended on taxes from the cities, the roads depended on maintenance crews paid by the army. The whole thing worked because of constant movement, goods flowing, people traveling, information spreading. When Rome fell, the machine didn't just stop, it started running in reverse. The cities that depended on imported grain began to shrink. As they shrank, they generated less tax revenue. With less revenue, roads couldn't be maintained. With roads crumbling, trade became harder. With trade declining, cities shrank further. It was a death spiral, and it happened fast. Within 100 years of Rome's fall, most major European cities had lost 80 to 90% of their population. Not because people were dying, though plenty were, but because urban life became impossible. When you can't get grain shipments and you can't maintain aqueducts, you move to the countryside where you can grow your own food and drink from wells. And when people moved out the cities, literacy went with them. Because here's what most people don't understand about literacy in the ancient world. It wasn't valuable for its own sake. You didn't learn to read and write because knowledge was important. You learned because you needed those skills for specific jobs. Government administration, tax collection, trade negotiations, legal contracts, all urban professions, all dependent on a functioning economy. In the countryside, literacy was useless. Worse than useless, it was a waste of time. Why spend years learning to read Latin when you could be learning to farm, to smith, to build? The practical skills that kept you alive didn't require reading, so people stopped teaching it. Within 2 generations, the children of literate Romans became illiterate farmers, and their children had no memory that literacy had ever been important. But it wasn't just literacy that vanished, it was technical knowledge of all kinds. How to build stone bridges, how to make concrete, how to survey land accurately, how to construct multi-story buildings. All of this knowledge was written down, carefully documented in Roman technical manuals. But if you can't read the manuals, the knowledge might as well not exist. Archaeological evidence from this period is absolutely haunting. We find Roman buildings being abandoned, then slowly dismantled for building materials. We find villa sites that just stop showing any signs of occupation around 450 or 500 CE. We find layers of what archaeologists call dark earth in former Roman towns, basically just accumulated garbage and decay covering the Roman remains. But here's where it gets really weird. The abandonment isn't uniform. Some regions descend into chaos quickly. Others maintain some level of organization for centuries. Britain, for example, seems to experience near total collapse. By 500 CE, British cities are abandoned. Pottery making, which had been a sophisticated industry, reverts to crude handmade vessels. Even basic stone construction seems to be forgotten. People are building in wood again, like their pre-Roman ancestors had. But in other places like Italy and parts of Gaul, there's continuity. Cities shrink but don't disappear. Literacy declines but doesn't vanish. Some level of trade continues. It's not uniform darkness. It's patchy, inconsistent, maddeningly hard to understand. And then there are the mysteries, the things we simply cannot explain. Take settlements. During the height of the Dark Ages, roughly 600 to 800 CE, we have archaeological evidence of thousands of small settlements across Europe, villages, hamlets, isolated farms. But we have almost no written records describing them. Who lived there? How were they organized? What did they believe? We can dig up their post holes and garbage pits, but we can't hear their voices. Some settlements show signs of careful planning. Rectangular buildings aligned in rows, suggesting some form of central authority. Others seem almost random, buildings scattered without pattern. Some have evidence of trade goods from hundreds of miles away. Others seem completely isolated. It's like trying to understand modern society by examining only the trash we throw away. You can learn something, but you miss everything important. The material remains tell us people were there, that they built things, that they traded sometimes, that they buried their dead with certain rituals. But the why remains hidden. Why did they choose to settle where they did? What stories did they tell their children? What did they dream about? What did they fear? These weren't primitive people, they were the descendants of Romans or the contemporaries of sophisticated cultures in other parts of the world. They had the same capacity for thought, for emotion, for complexity that we have, but their inner lives, their thoughts, their beliefs, almost everything that made them human beyond the physical artifacts they left behind, is lost to us. We can measure their buildings, analyze their pottery, map their trade routes, but we can't know them. Then came the Vikings. Starting around 793 CE, with the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery, Scandinavian seafarers began ranging across Europe and beyond. And here's what's so frustrating. We know the Vikings were incredibly successful. They established trade networks from Baghdad to North America. They founded cities that still exist today. They developed sophisticated shipbuilding techniques that allowed them to cross oceans, but we don't really know how they did it. The Norse didn't start writing things down until they converted to Christianity centuries after their expansion began. Everything we know about early Viking society comes from archaeological evidence and much later sagas that are half legend, half history, and completely unreliable for dating or details. How did Norse society organize expeditions involving hundreds of men and dozens of ships? How did they navigate across open ocean without compasses? How did they maintain supply lines across thousands of miles? We have theories, educated guesses, but the truth is we just don't know. The Vikings left us their artifacts but not their manuals. We can see what they accomplished, but not how they accomplished it. We know they reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, but we don't know how they convinced crews to sail into unknown waters, or how they organized the logistics of such voyages, or what navigation techniques they used. The only place where knowledge was being systematically preserved was in monasteries. As the Roman world collapsed, the Christian church became the last institution with the resources and motivation to maintain literacy. Monks copied manuscripts, laboriously reproducing ancient texts by hand. Everything we know about classical literature we know because some medieval monk thought it was worth copying. But here's the tragedy. The monks were selective. They preserved what they thought was important, which meant religious texts and works by Christian authors got priority. Pagan literature, scientific treatises, technical manuals, huge swaths of ancient knowledge were simply left to decay. We know of hundreds of ancient texts that existed in the early medieval period, but don't exist now. We have references to them in surviving documents, quotations, mentions in other works, but the works themselves are gone, lost when the last copy crumbled to dust or was destroyed, and sometimes the preservation itself was destructive. Vellum, the specially prepared animal skin used for writing, was expensive, so monks would sometimes scrape off older text to reuse the vellum for new documents. These are called palimpsests, and modern imaging technology can sometimes read the erased text underneath. What we've found is heartbreaking. Lost plays by Sophocles, scientific treatises by unknown Roman authors, historical accounts that would fill crucial gaps in our knowledge, all scraped away to make room for copies of texts that already existed in dozens of versions. Imagine being the monk who made that decision. You need vellum for a new copy of the Gospels. You have an old manuscript, something pagan, something you've been taught is less important than Christian works. You scrape it away, reuse the valuable material. You're doing what makes sense in your worldview, what your abbot has instructed you to do. You have no idea that 1,000 years later, scholars will use advanced technology to try to read what you erased, mourning the loss of knowledge you considered worthless. The population decline during this period was staggering, though we can't put precise numbers on it. Some estimates suggest Europe's population fell by 50% or more between 400 and 600 CE. This wasn't primarily due to war or invasion. It was disease, malnutrition, and the collapse of the trade networks that had allowed specialized urban populations to exist. When populations collapse, so does specialization. In a city of 50,000, you can afford to have full-time scribes, architects, engineers. In a village of 200, everyone needs to be a generalist. Everyone needs to know how to grow food, make tools, build shelter. The specialist knowledge that created Roman civilization became a luxury nobody could afford. Why train as an architect when there are no new buildings being constructed? Why become a full-time scribe when there's almost nothing that needs to be written down and no one who can read it? Recent discoveries are starting to fill in some gaps, though each answer raises new questions. Excavations across Europe have revealed that the so-called Dark Ages weren't as dark as we thought. We found evidence of sophisticated metalworking continuing throughout the period. We've discovered extensive trade networks that nobody knew existed. We've uncovered burial sites with grave goods from thousands of miles away, proving that long-distance travel never completely stopped. But these discoveries also highlight how much we've lost. Every sophisticated artifact we find raises the question, if they could make this, what else could they make that we haven't found? Every trade good from distant lands suggests networks and relationships we don't understand. Every well-constructed building proves there were architects and engineers whose names we'll never know. Each discovery illuminates a tiny corner of the darkness, but also reveals how vast that darkness truly is. The Dark Ages weren't dark because nothing was happening. They're dark because we can't see what was happening. Somewhere between 400 and 1000 CE, Europe transformed completely. The world of city-states and empire gave way to the world of feudalism and monarchy. Classical culture died, and medieval culture was born. Technologies were lost and different technologies were invented. Languages evolved, populations migrated, entire peoples appeared and disappeared, and we missed almost all of it. We're like someone watching a movie where 90% of the frames are missing. We can see the beginning and the end. But the transformation itself, the crucial middle part, is just gone. We know Rome fell, we know medieval Europe emerged, but how one became the other, the actual process of transformation, remains frustratingly unclear. Now, let's talk about a gap in history that's much closer to home. One that's particularly frustrating because it happened recently enough that we should know what occurred, but vast sections of it remain complete blanks. The Americas before European contact. And here's what makes this gap so maddening. We're not talking about trying to piece together what happened 10,000 years ago. We're talking about thriving civilizations that existed just 500 to 600 years ago. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands, complex societies with extensive trade networks. And yet, for huge stretches of this history, we know almost nothing, because here's the thing about pre-Columbian America. When the first Europeans arrived, they found what looked like a mostly empty continent. Scattered indigenous groups, yes, but vast regions that appeared virtually uninhabited. Early colonists saw this and assumed the Americas had always been sparsely populated. This became the dominant narrative. The New World as a pristine wilderness, barely touched by human hands. But archaeology tells a completely different story. The evidence suggests that on the eve of European contact, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. That's not a minor population. That's comparable to Europe's population at the same time. These people lived in cities, built monumental architecture, created complex agricultural systems, and developed sophisticated social organizations. Then within a century of European contact, maybe 90% of them were gone, and they took their history with them. Start with Cahokia. Most people have never heard of it, but around the year 1050, it was the largest city in North America. Not the largest indigenous city, the largest city, period. Bigger than London, bigger than Paris. A sprawling metropolis near modern-day St. Louis, with a population estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 people, maybe more. The archaeological evidence suggests the actual urban area might have housed 40,000 people at its peak. Think about that for a moment. 40,000 people living in a planned urban center with distinct neighborhoods, massive earthen pyramids, and a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and engineering. The largest mound at Cahokia, Monk's Mound, covers 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet high. It contains roughly 22 million cubic feet of earth, all moved by hand, one basket at a time. This is more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it's just one of over 120 mounds that once stood at the site. The city was laid out with precise alignments to solar events. The people of Cahokia built a woodhenge, a circle of massive cedar posts that tracked the solstices and equinoxes. They constructed a grand plaza larger than 35 football fields. They built residential districts with thousands of homes. They created a massive palisade around the central city, a wall that required 20,000 logs and would have taken a coordinated labor force years to complete. This wasn't a simple village. This was a civilization. The Mississippian culture, as archaeologists call it, dominated the Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries for centuries. They built hundreds of mound sites across what is now the southeastern United States. They developed long-distance trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains. Shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from Lake Superior, obsidian from the Rockies, all flowing through a commercial network that would have required sophisticated economic organization. Think about what this means. Someone in Cahokia could possess a copper ornament that was mined in what is now Michigan, 1,000 miles away, a shell necklace that came from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian blades from the Rocky Mountains. This wasn't occasional trade. This was a sustained economic system that moved goods across vast distances, implying established routes, trading posts, professional merchants, and the social organization to maintain it all for generations. The architecture alone tells us this was a complex society. The Great Mounds weren't just piles of dirt. They were carefully engineered structures built in stages over decades, sometimes centuries. Different colored soils were used in layers, suggesting ritual significance to the construction process itself. The alignment to astronomical events wasn't approximate, it was precise, requiring sophisticated observation and mathematical calculation. And then around 1350, Cahokia was abandoned, not destroyed by conquest, not burned by invaders, just emptied. Within a few decades, a city that had dominated the region for 3 centuries was gone, its people scattered, its buildings left to decay. By the time Europeans arrived in the region in the 1500s, Cahokia had been abandoned for more than 150 years. The native peoples living nearby had no clear memory of who had built these massive earthworks. The history was lost. We still don't know why Cahokia fell. The theories are numerous but unsatisfying. Maybe environmental degradation. The city's enormous population would have required intensive agriculture, possibly depleting the soil. Deforestation to build the palisade and thousands of homes would have changed the local climate and watershed. Maybe climate change. There's evidence of a regional drought around the time of abandonment. Maybe political collapse. Perhaps the social systems that had united such a large population simply broke down. Maybe disease, a pandemic, could have devastated the dense urban population. Maybe violence. There's some archaeological evidence of conflict in the final years, but we don't know. The people who could have told us were gone before anyone thought to write it down. And Cahokia wasn't unique. The Mississippian culture built similar cities throughout the eastern half of North America. Etowah in Georgia, Moundville in Alabama, Spiro in Oklahoma, each with thousands of inhabitants, monumental architecture, and complex social organization. Most were abandoned before European contact. The few that were still occupied when Europeans arrived were quickly destroyed by disease, warfare, and forced displacement. Their histories died with them. Move west and you find the same pattern. The ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, built some of the most spectacular architecture in North America. Cities carved into cliff faces, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon. These weren't simple dwellings. Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon had over 600 rooms and rose 4 stories high. It was the largest building in North America, until the 1880s when it was finally surpassed by an apartment building in New York. Chaco was the center of a civilization that dominated the Four Corners region for centuries. The Chacoans built hundreds of miles of perfectly straight roads connecting outlying settlements to the central canyon. Not trails, roads up to 30 feet wide, engineered with deliberate construction techniques. They aligned buildings to solar and lunar cycles with precision that required sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They managed water in a desert environment through an elaborate system of dams, reservoirs, and irrigation channels. The scale of what they accomplished in such a harsh environment is staggering. Chaco Canyon receives less than 10 inches of rain per year, yet they supported a population of thousands, importing food from outlying areas, managing every drop of water through careful engineering. The great houses weren't just buildings, they were astronomical observatories, ceremonial centers, administrative complexes, and symbols of power all rolled into one. And then around 1150 they left. The great houses at Chaco Canyon were abandoned. The road system fell into disuse. A civilization that had thrived for 300 years simply walked away. We find hints of where they went. Modern Pueblo peoples are clearly their descendants, carrying forward aspects of their culture, language, and traditions. But the specific history of what happened, why they left, where exactly they went, most of it is gone. Another gap in the historical record. The archaeological evidence from across the Americas tells the same story again and again. Evidence of large populations, sophisticated societies, complex cultural achievements, followed by sudden abandonment, disappearance, or collapse, often shortly before or shortly after European contact. And here's what makes this particularly tragic: the timing. Because European contact didn't just bring colonization and conquest, it brought disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity. The epidemics moved faster than the Europeans themselves. Ships arriving on the coast would introduce diseases that would spread inland through trade networks, devastating populations hundreds of miles away from any European settlement. By the time colonists pushed into the interior, they were often moving through lands that had been depopulated by diseases that had arrived years or even decades earlier. The scale of this catastrophe is almost impossible to comprehend. Contemporary accounts from early Spanish explorers in the southeast describe densely populated regions with towns every few miles. The Spanish chronicler Hernando de Soto, traveling through the southeast in 1540, described thriving towns, abundant agriculture, and large populations. But when French explorers traveled the same routes 150 years later, they found the landscape nearly empty. The cities were gone, the people were gone. What had happened? Disease, wave after wave of epidemics tearing through populations with no resistance. Communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out in a generation, and when the people died, so did their knowledge. Their history, passed down orally through generations, died with the last storytellers. Their cultural practices, their social organization, their understanding of their own past, all lost. Imagine being one of the last survivors of such a plague. Everyone who knew the old stories is dead. The elders who could explain the meaning of the ceremonies, gone. The leaders who understood how to organize the community, gone. The craftspeople who knew the traditional techniques, gone. You're left with fragments, pieces of knowledge you half remember from your childhood, trying to rebuild a culture that has been shattered beyond recognition. And this happened not once, but repeatedly, as waves of different diseases swept through indigenous populations. First contact would bring one disease, survivors would begin to rebuild, then another disease would arrive, and another, each wave killing a significant portion of the remaining population, each wave eroding more cultural knowledge, disrupting more social structures, destroying more of the accumulated wisdom of generations. We get hints of what was lost from the few written accounts that survive. When Europeans first reached the upper Mississippi Valley in the late 1600s, they encountered enormous earthwork complexes, mounds in elaborate geometric patterns, some covering hundreds of acres. The indigenous people living nearby told the French that they didn't know who had built them. The knowledge was already lost, the civilizations that had created these monuments having collapsed before living memory. Modern archaeology has revealed just how much we've lost. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR surveys, and satellite imagery have revealed thousands of previously unknown archaeological sites across the Americas. In the Amazon, which was long thought to be pristine wilderness, LiDAR has found evidence of massive pre-Columbian settlements, earthworks covering thousands of square miles, evidence of sophisticated agricultural systems supporting large populations, cities in the jungle that were abandoned and reclaimed by the forest before Europeans ever reached them. The Amazon findings are particularly stunning. We're discovering evidence of urban planning, road networks, water management systems, agricultural terraces, all hidden under centuries of jungle growth. Some estimates now suggest the Amazon basin may have supported populations in the millions before European contact. Millions of people whose history is almost completely unknown. In North America, surveys have revealed that the earthwork complexes are far more extensive than previously thought. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, built by the Hopewell culture around 100 CE, covers nearly 4 square miles. It includes precise geometric shapes, circles, squares and octagons aligned to astronomical events. This required not just labor but sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. The precision is remarkable. The octagon and circle at Newark are connected by parallel walls that align perfectly with the 18.6-year lunar cycle. This means the builders had to observe the moon carefully for decades to understand this cycle, then encode that knowledge in earthen architecture that has lasted 2,000 years. That's sophisticated astronomy, sophisticated mathematics and sophisticated engineering, all from a culture we know almost nothing about. And we have no written records explaining why they built it, what it meant to them, how they organized the labor, how they maintained these sites for centuries. We can measure the earthworks, analyze the alignments, excavate the artifacts, but we can't know what the builders were thinking. What cosmology drove them to invest such enormous effort in these constructions? What rituals took place there? What did they believe about the moon, the stars, the cosmos? Population estimates for pre-Columbian North America keep rising as archaeology reveals more evidence of settlement. Current estimates suggest there may have been 5 to 10 million people living north of Mexico before European contact, most of them living in complex societies with social hierarchies, trade networks and cultural achievements that rivaled anything in Europe at the time. And we know almost nothing about the specific history of most of these societies, who their leaders were, what their belief systems entailed, how they organized their economies, what stories they told about their own origins. The gap in our knowledge is staggering. We have better records of ancient Rome, which existed 2,000 years ago, than we do of Cahokia, which was thriving just 600 years ago. We can trace the political intrigues of medieval European kingdoms in exhaustive detail, but we can barely reconstruct the basic outlines of Mississippian political organization. We have extensive written records from ancient China spanning millennia, but virtually nothing written about the ancestral Pueblones by the ancestral Pueblones themselves. This gap exists not because these civilizations were primitive or unimportant. It exists because they developed different technologies for recording information. Most relied on oral traditions rather than written records, and oral traditions, no matter how sophisticated, are vulnerable. They require continuous transmission from one generation to the next. Break that chain through disease, warfare, or forced displacement, and the knowledge is lost forever. Modern indigenous communities retain fragments of this history, oral traditions, cultural practices, spiritual beliefs that connect them to their ancestors, but even these connections are often incomplete, broken by centuries of colonization, forced relocation, and cultural suppression. The descendants of these great civilizations often know their ancestors built the mounds, carved the cliffs, created the earthworks, but the specific details, the why and the how, much of it has been lost. So we're left with monuments without context, earthworks covering thousands of acres that we can map but not understand, sophisticated astronomical alignments whose purpose we can only guess at, trade networks spanning a continent whose economic organization remains mysterious, cities that house tens of thousands whose social structures are barely known, and a demographic catastrophe so complete that it erased the cultural memory of entire civilizations before that memory could be recorded in a form that would survive. The Americas before Columbus weren't empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were home to millions of people living in complex societies with their own histories, achievements, and stories. And most of those stories are gone, lost in the gap between the collapse of pre-Columbian civilizations and the arrival of written records. Another hole in human history. Another reminder that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, it's often just evidence of tragedy. Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. Around 3300 BCE, while Mesopotamia and Egypt were just figuring out how to build cities, a civilization emerged in the Indus River Valley that was in almost every measurable way more advanced than both of them. Better urban planning, more sophisticated sanitation systems, standardized weights and measures, evidence of long-distance trade networks stretching from Mesopotamia to Central Asia. And then around 1300 BCE, it just vanished. Not slowly, not with dramatic collapse, just faded away into historical silence. And here's the really disturbing part. We have no idea what they called themselves. No idea how their government worked. No idea what gods they worshipped, or what stories they told their children. We can't read their writing. We don't know their language. For a civilization that lasted 2,000 years and covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, we know almost nothing about how they actually lived. Think about that for a second. The Harappan civilization, as archaeologists call it, had a population estimated at 5 million people at its peak. 5 million. That's more people than lived in all of ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom. They built over 1,400 settlements, including massive cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, with populations reaching 40,000 or more. These weren't primitive villages. These were planned cities with grid layouts, advanced drainage systems, public baths and multi-story buildings. They were doing urban planning that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Roman Empire. And yet, when you walk through a museum and look at Egyptian artifacts, you can read the hieroglyphs, understand the religious texts, know the names of pharaohs and the stories of their gods. But when you look at Indus Valley seals with their mysterious symbols, all you get is silence. Beautiful, intricate, maddeningly silent. The archaeological evidence of Harappan sophistication is everywhere once you start looking. Take Mohenjo-Daro, probably the best preserved Harappan city. The name means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, which tells you nothing about what its inhabitants actually called it. Everything we know about them comes from what they left behind. And what they left behind is extraordinary. The city was built on a grid pattern with streets intersecting at right angles, not random organic growth like most ancient cities, but deliberate planning. Main streets running north-south, secondary streets running east-west, creating uniform city blocks. Buildings constructed with standardized fired bricks, all in the exact same ratio of dimensions. This wasn't just one architect's vision. This was a civilization-wide standard that lasted for centuries across hundreds of settlements. Someone had to establish those standards. Someone had to enforce them. But we have no idea who. No palaces, no temples clearly identified as religious centers, no monuments to powerful kings, no inscriptions proclaiming great victories or divine authority. And then there's the drainage system. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro was connected to a sophisticated network of covered drains running along the streets. Bathrooms with toilets, wells for fresh water, the Great Bath, a massive public bathing complex with waterproof walls, and a complex drainage system. This level of civic infrastructure centralized planning and maintenance. You don't build citywide sanitation systems without administrative organization, without taxes or labor systems, without someone making decisions about where drains go and how they're maintained. But there's no archaeological evidence of the kind of administrative buildings you'd expect. No massive temple complexes like in Mesopotamia. No giant palace compounds like in Egypt. Just uniform housing, well-planned streets, and this incredible infrastructure that somehow maintained itself for 1,000 years without leaving obvious traces of the government that must have created it. The Indus script makes everything worse, not better, worse, because we know they had writing. We have over 4,000 inscribed objects, mostly small seals showing animals, human figures and sequences of symbols. The script appears on pottery, copper tablets, and those famous steatite seals that probably served as markers of ownership or identity. The symbols are beautiful, consisting of about 400 distinct signs, suggesting a logographic writing system like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. But here's the problem. The inscriptions are incredibly short. Most contain fewer than 5 symbols. The longest known inscription has only 26 symbols. This makes decipherment nearly impossible. With such short texts, you can't identify patterns reliably. You can't figure out grammar or syntax. You can't even be certain whether it should be read left to right, right to left, or in alternating directions. Scholars have been trying to crack the Indus script for over a century. Some think it's a true writing system representing spoken language. Others argue it's just a collection of symbolic markers like modern corporate logos, conveying information but not representing speech. There's no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text that could provide a key to understanding. The civilization existed alongside Mesopotamia, and there's evidence of trade between them. But no Indus Valley text has been found written in cuneiform, and no cuneiform text clearly describes the Harpan people in enough detail to help us understand their language. It's like finding a library where every book has only the title remaining, and the title is in a language no living person speaks. You know there was knowledge there. You know they had things to say, but the actual content is locked away forever unless we can somehow crack the code. Recent technological advances have brought new hope, but also new controversies. Computer scientists have analyzed the Indus script using statistical methods, comparing it to known languages and random symbolic sequences. Some studies suggest the pattern of symbol combinations is consistent with linguistic structure, implying it really is writing. Other researchers remain skeptical, pointing out that short texts can produce misleading statistical patterns. Machine learning algorithms have been trained on the available inscriptions, trying to identify grammatical rules or predict missing symbols in damaged texts. These approaches have produced interesting hypotheses, but nothing definitive. The fundamental problem remains. Without longer texts or a bilingual inscription, we're essentially trying to learn an entire language from nothing but business cards and shipping labels. and this gap in understanding extends to everything about Harpan society. We find standardized weights and measures suggesting regulated trade and commerce, but no clear evidence of markets or merchant quarters. We see elaborate jewelry and art objects indicating specialized craftspeople and social differentiation, but no obvious palaces or elite residences that would show clear hierarchies. The uniformity of housing is actually striking. Unlike in Mesopotamian cities where elite homes cluster near temples, or Egyptian settlements with obvious distinctions between administrator housing and worker quarters, Harpan cities show remarkably similar structures across most of the site. Sure, some houses are bigger than others, but there's nothing like the massive palatial compounds you'd expect in a civilization this large and sophisticated. This has led to wild speculation about Harpan governance. Some scholars have proposed they had a more egalitarian social structure, perhaps ruled by merchant councils rather than kings. Others suggest they were controlled by a priest class whose power was spiritual rather than military, which would explain the lack of obvious palaces but presence of structures like the Great Bath that might have had ritual significance. A few have even proposed they had no centralized government at all, that somehow they maintained their standardization and infrastructure through cultural consensus and tradition rather than top-down authority. But these are all guesses. Educated guesses based on archaeological evidence, but still guesses filling the void left by our inability to read their own words about themselves. The religious practices are equally mysterious. We find figurines that might be goddesses or might be toys. Seals showing figures in yoga-like poses that might be gods or might be humans. Animals that appear repeatedly like bulls and elephants and tigers that might have religious significance or might just be common subjects for art. There's a famous seal showing a seated figure surrounded by animals that some scholars identify as a proto-Shiva, suggesting continuity between Harpan religion and later Hinduism. Others argue this is projecting later religious concepts backward onto evidence that doesn't really support it. Without texts explaining religious beliefs, without clear temples or obvious religious iconography, we're left inferring spiritual life from ambiguous artifacts. And then there's the disappearance. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities began to decline. Not suddenly, but gradually over centuries. Building quality decreased. The careful urban planning became less strict. Some settlements were abandoned. By 1300 BCE, the major cities were largely deserted and the civilization as a distinct cultural entity had essentially vanished. But there's no evidence of conquest. No burned layers suggesting invasion, no mass graves indicating plague. The climate did change, with the monsoon pattern shifting and some rivers changing course, which would have affected agriculture and trade. But civilizations don't usually just fade away peacefully because of gradual climate change. They transform, they migrate, they adapt. The Harpans seem to have done all of these things, dispersing into smaller settlements, possibly moving east toward the Ganges Valley. But in the process they lost whatever centralized culture had maintained their distinctive civilization. Then comes the gap. The period between the decline of the Harpan civilization and the emergence of Vedic culture around 1500 BCE is murky and contested. The Vedic people spoke an Indo-European language, Sanskrit, completely unrelated to whatever language the Harpans spoke. The Vedic texts, composed over centuries and eventually written down, contain no clear memories of the great cities of the Indus Valley, no stories about abandoned urban centers, no legends explaining the mysterious ruins. It's as if the Harpan civilization had been completely forgotten within a few centuries of its decline. Some scholars suggest there was cultural continuity, that elements of Harpan religion and culture were absorbed into Vedic tradition. Others see a complete break, a replacement of one culture by another, but without texts from the Harpans themselves, without clear archaeological evidence of the transition, we're left with competing theories and insufficient data. Why do we know so little despite extensive remains? Part of the problem is preservation. The Indus Valley has been continuously inhabited for 5,000 years. Modern cities sit on top of ancient ones. Agriculture has disturbed countless sites. The region's climate isn't ideal for preserving organic materials like wood or cloth or paper that might have contained longer texts. But other civilizations face similar challenges and still left decipherable records. The real issue is the script. Without the ability to read their writing, we can't access their own explanations of themselves. We're reduced to making inferences from physical evidence, and physical evidence alone can't tell you what people believed, how they organized themselves politically, what stories they told, what they thought was important. We're left with this strange paradox. A civilization sophisticated enough to maintain urban infrastructure for 1,000 years, to standardize measurements and construction across a vast territory, to conduct long-distance trade and create beautiful art, but one that remains fundamentally unknowable to us. They had context, deep, meaningful context for everything they did, but that context is lost. All we have are the artifacts, beautiful and mute, telling us that something remarkable happened here, but refusing to explain what it meant to the people who created it. Somewhere in those undeciphered symbols are answers, names and stories and explanations. The Harpans knew who they were. They just never imagined that one day nobody else would. When we talk about ancient history, we speak with confidence about Roman emperors, Chinese dynasties, Persian kings. We can tell you what they ate, how they dressed, who they married. We have their words, their laws, their poetry. But ask about the kingdoms of medieval West Africa, the empires that controlled the gold trade and made European kings jealous. And suddenly the story gets fuzzy. Ask about the people who built Great Zimbabwe, one of the most impressive stone structures in the ancient world, and we shrug. Ask about the Nok culture, who were smelting iron in West Africa, while Europe was still figuring out bronze working, and we admit we barely know their names. This isn't because Africa lacked sophisticated civilizations. It's because we lost their stories, or more accurately, we discarded them, dismissed them, allowed them to slip through the cracks of historical preservation until vast stretches of African history became gaps, mysteries, lost centuries waiting to be rediscovered. The problem starts with how history gets preserved. In Europe and Asia, written records stretch back thousands of years. Mesopotamian clay tablets documenting grain sales from 3000 BCE. Egyptian hieroglyphs detailing the reigns of pharaohs. Chinese chronicles recording everything from astronomical events to court gossip. These civilizations developed writing systems early and used them obsessively, creating redundant copies of important documents, carving records into stone that would last millennia. But many African civilizations took a different approach. They preserved their histories through oral tradition, elaborate systems of storytelling, poetry and song passed down through specialized groups of historians called griots. These weren't casual campfire tales. They were precisely memorized accounts, sometimes hours long, recounting genealogies, major events, cultural practices. In societies with strong oral traditions, griots could recite the names and deeds of rulers going back dozens of generations without missing a detail. The problem is that oral traditions don't survive societal collapse the way stone inscriptions do. When a civilization falls to war, disease, or environmental catastrophe, its libraries might burn. But archaeologists can still excavate the ruins, find the tablets, reconstruct the written records. But if the griots die without passing on their knowledge, if the cultural continuity gets broken, the history simply vanishes. No ruins to excavate, no artifacts to translate, just silence where there should be stories. This is exactly what happened across much of Sub-Saharan Africa. Not because these civilizations were less sophisticated, but because the catastrophes they faced were so complete that the chains of oral transmission got severed. And when European colonizers arrived, they weren't interested in preserving what remained. They were interested in claiming the continent had no history worth preserving at all. Take Great Zimbabwe. In the hills of southeastern Africa stands one of the most remarkable architectural achievements of the medieval world. Massive stone walls, some 36 feet high, built without mortar from perfectly fitted granite blocks. A complex of enclosures covering nearly 1,800 acres featuring a conical tower, intricate passageways, and sophisticated drainage systems. At its peak around 1300 CE, this was the capital of a kingdom that controlled the gold trade between the African interior and coastal Swahili merchants. Home to perhaps 18,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in medieval Africa. When European colonizers first encountered these ruins in the late 19th century, they couldn't believe Africans had built them. There had to be another explanation. They claimed the structures were Phoenician, built by King Solomon's miners, constructed by lost Arab traders. Anything except the obvious truth that indigenous African peoples had created a sophisticated stone-building civilization. This wasn't just racist dismissal, though it was certainly that, it was erasure. By denying that local peoples could have built Great Zimbabwe, colonizers justified erasing the oral histories that still existed, the traditions that could have told us who these builders were, how their society functioned, why they eventually abandoned this magnificent city. Instead of preserving and recording these accounts, colonial authorities actively suppressed them. The result is that even now, more than a century after archaeologists definitively proved Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans, we still don't know crucial details about the civilization that created it. We don't know the builder's name for their city. We don't know the titles of their rulers or the organization of their government. We have only fragments of their trading networks, hints of their religious practices, questions without answers about why such a powerful kingdom left no written records and eventually faded from prominence. The kingdom of Kush tells a similar story, but with an added layer of tragic irony. For over 1,000 years, from around 1070 BCE to 350 CE, the Kushite civilization thrived along the Nile in what is now Sudan. At various times they conquered and ruled Egypt itself. Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty controlled one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. They built pyramids, not copies of Egyptian designs, but their own distinctive style, steeper and more numerous. They developed their own writing system, Meroitic script, which we find on temples, tombs, and everyday objects. Here's the tragedy. We can't read it. Despite decades of effort by linguists and archaeologists, Meroitic script remains largely undeciphered. We know it's not related to Egyptian hieroglyphs, though it borrowed some symbols. We can identify names and a few words, but full texts remain opaque, locked away by the simple fact that when the Kushite kingdom fell, apparently nobody survived who could teach the script's meanings to later generations. Think about what we've lost. Imagine if we couldn't read ancient Greek or Latin. Imagine if all of Roman history was a mystery. All of Greek philosophy lost because nobody remembered how to decode the letters. That's the situation with Kush. We have their monuments, their artifacts, their cities. We know they were sophisticated, powerful, culturally rich, but their own words, their own accounts of their history remain silent. A gap we may never be able to fill. The Nok culture presents an even more perplexing mystery. Starting around 1500 BCE, in the Jols Plateau of what is now Nigeria, somebody began creating distinctive terracotta sculptures, elaborate human figures with stylized features, detailed hairstyles, ornate jewelry. These weren't crude figurines. They were sophisticated artwork showing technical mastery and consistent artistic traditions. More importantly, the Nok were smelting iron by 1000 BCE, making them among the earliest ironworking cultures in the world. They skipped the Bronze Age entirely, moving directly from stone tools to iron implements. This suggests either independent innovation, which would be remarkable, or contact with ironworking cultures from elsewhere. which would rewrite our understanding of ancient trade networks. But we don't know which. We don't know who the Nok were, what they called themselves, how their society was organized. We don't know if they had writing, though no examples have survived. We don't know their language, their mythology, their political structures. All we have are their remarkable sculptures scattered across a region that was later disrupted by migrations, state formations, and eventually colonial conquest. Whatever oral traditions might have preserved Nok history were lost in the turbulence of the following millennia. The pattern repeats across the continent. Medieval West African empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai controlled trade networks spanning thousands of miles, amassed wealth that made them legendary even in distant Europe. The Mali Empire's ruler, Mansa Musa, famously crashed the gold market in Cairo during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 by spending so lavishly that gold prices didn't recover for years. We know this happened because Arab scholars documented it. We have outside observers' accounts of these kingdoms' wealth and power, but internal records, the day-to-day functioning of these empires, the perspectives of their own historians, these are frustratingly fragmentary. We know the names of some rulers, the outlines of some wars and successions, but vast periods remain obscure, understood only through archaeological inference and the scattered accounts of foreign visitors. Part of this gap is natural historical loss, but part is deliberate destruction. When colonial powers carved up Africa in the late 19th century, they weren't interested in preserving indigenous historical traditions. They were interested in claiming that Africa had no history, no civilizations worth respecting, no accomplishments that would complicate the narrative of European superiority. Libraries were burned, not accidentally but systematically. Oral historians were dismissed as unreliable, their carefully preserved traditions discarded as primitive mythology. Archaeological sites were looted for objects to fill European museums with no regard for context or preservation of knowledge. And perhaps most insidiously, African children were taught that their ancestors had no history, that civilization began when Europeans arrived, that anything impressive on the continent must have been built by outside influences. The consequences of this erasure are still felt today. Entire centuries of African history remain shadowy, understood only through fragmentary evidence and archaeological guesswork. We know sophisticated societies existed. We can see their artifacts, their architecture, their influence on surrounding regions, but their stories, their own accounts of who they were and what they achieved, these are often lost. But here's where the story starts to turn hopeful, because unlike some historical gaps where evidence simply doesn't exist anymore, much of African history isn't lost. It's just been ignored, dismissed, waiting to be properly studied and preserved. Recent decades have seen an explosion of archaeological work across Sub-Saharan Africa, revealing complex societies that colonial-era scholarship claimed didn't exist. In southern Africa, excavations have uncovered extensive trade networks dating back over 1,000 years, with goods from as far away as China and India showing up in local settlements. In West Africa, ancient cities like Gene are rewriting our understanding of urban development, showing sophisticated city planning centuries before contact with Islamic or European civilizations. In East Africa, researchers are documenting the Swahili coastal cities that mediated trade between the African interior and the Indian Ocean world, creating a unique fusion culture that was neither purely African nor purely Arab, but something distinctive and sophisticated in its own right. And linguists are working with remaining oral traditions, carefully recording and analyzing the historical information they contain, cross-referencing with archaeological evidence to build more complete pictures of the past. Perhaps most importantly, there's growing recognition that the absence of written records doesn't mean the absence of history. Oral traditions, when properly studied and contextualized, can preserve remarkable amounts of accurate information across many generations. Archaeological evidence, from settlement patterns to artifacts to environmental data, can reconstruct societal structures even without written documents. The lost centuries of African history aren't necessarily lost forever. They're just harder to access, requiring more careful work, more respect for different forms of historical preservation, more willingness to challenge old assumptions about what counts as legitimate historical evidence. Every year brings new discoveries. Ancient cities emerging from jungle vegetation, genetic studies revealing unexpected migration patterns, linguistic analysis showing cultural connections nobody had suspected. The gaps are slowly being filled, not with speculation but with evidence, careful scholarship, and most importantly, African voices reclaiming their own histories. The story of Africa's lost centuries is ultimately a story about whose histories get preserved and whose get discarded, whose accounts matter and whose don't. For too long, the answer was determined by colonial power and racist assumptions, but that's changing. The silences are being broken, the gaps are being filled, and what's emerging is a picture of human history far richer and more complex than the simple narratives we inherited from an earlier, more prejudiced era. Now, let's talk about the largest ocean on Earth, and one of the most audacious human achievements in history. An achievement that for some reason we barely understand at all. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly 64 million square miles. That's roughly 1/3 of the entire Earth's surface. And scattered across this vast expanse are thousands of islands. Some are large like New Zealand and Hawaii. Others are tiny specks of coral and volcanic rock, barely visible from more than a few miles away. And here's what's remarkable. By about 1200 CE, nearly every inhabitable island in this enormous ocean had been discovered, settled, and colonized by people traveling in wooden canoes. No compasses, no sextants, no GPS, just outrigger canoes, knowledge of stars and currents, and an almost incomprehensible amount of courage. This was the Polynesian expansion, one of the greatest feats of exploration and navigation in human history. And we have almost no idea how they actually did it. Think about what we're talking about here. These weren't short coastal hops. Polynesian voyagers traveled thousands of miles across open ocean, locating islands that were sometimes less than 10 miles across, surrounded by hundreds or thousands of miles of empty water in every direction. The distance from Tahiti to Hawaii is about 2,600 miles. The distance from Tahiti to New Zealand is over 2,400 miles, and Easter Island, the most remote inhabited island on Earth, sits 1,200 miles from the nearest land mass. Yet all of these places were found, settled and connected by regular voyaging routes. How did they do it? We know some things. Polynesian navigators used sophisticated techniques called wayfinding. They memorized the positions of hundreds of stars, understanding exactly which stars rose and set at specific points on the horizon depending on latitude. They read wave patterns, recognizing how swells bent and reflected around distant islands that were still below the horizon. They watched birds, knowing that certain species only flew within a certain range of land. They paid attention to clouds, understanding how weather patterns changed near islands. They even tracked the path of bioluminescent organisms in the water, which could indicate the presence of channels and currents. But here's the problem. By the time European explorers arrived in the Pacific in the 1500s and 1600s, most of this knowledge was already being lost. The great age of Polynesian exploration had ended centuries earlier. The voyaging routes that had once connected islands across thousands of miles had been largely abandoned. The last major expansion, the settlement of New Zealand by the Maori around 1300 CE, had happened 200 years before Europeans arrived. And in those intervening centuries, much of the detailed navigational knowledge had faded from living memory. What we know about traditional Polynesian navigation comes mostly from a handful of islands in Micronesia, where the traditions survived into the 20th century. Researchers in the 1960s and 70s worked with master navigators from places like the Caroline Islands, documenting their techniques and attempting to reconstruct the lost art of wayfinding. These efforts led to the construction of modern replicas of traditional voyaging canoes and successful experimental voyages across thousands of miles of ocean. But here's the thing, we still don't know if what survived in Micronesia is the same as what was used during the Great Polynesian Expansion 1,000 years earlier. We don't know how complete our knowledge is, we don't know what we've lost, and that's just the navigation. The mysteries get even deeper when you look at specific islands and what happened there. Take Easter Island, Rapa Nui. This place has become almost mythical in popular culture. The massive stone heads, the munari staring inland across the island. The story that is usually told goes like this. Polynesian voyagers arrived around 1200 CE. They found a pristine island covered in palm forests. They flourished for a few centuries building those famous statues, but then they cut down all the trees, destroyed their environment, and their civilization collapsed into warfare and cannibalism by the time Europeans arrived in 1722. It's held up as a cautionary tale about environmental destruction, a civilization that destroyed itself through ecological mismanagement. But recent research suggests this story is at best incomplete and at worst completely wrong. First, the timeline of settlement keeps getting pushed back. Early estimates said 1200 CE, then 800 CE. Now some researchers think it might have been as early as 400 CE. That would mean the Rapa Nui civilization lasted over 1,000 years before European contact, not just a few centuries. Second, the environmental collapse narrative is being questioned. Yes, the palm forest disappeared, but new evidence suggests this might have been partly due to rats that arrived with the Polynesian settlers, not just human deforestation. The rats ate the palm nuts, preventing regeneration. Without the palms, the ecology changed, but it didn't necessarily collapse. Third, the warfare and cannibalism story comes almost entirely from European accounts written after European diseases had already devastated the island population. We're looking at a society in collapse due to introduced diseases and literally making up stories about what happened before contact. What was Rapa Nui society actually like at its height? We don't really know. We know they carved and moved hundreds of massive stone statues, some weighing over 80 tons. We know they developed a unique writing system called Rongorongo, one of only a handful of independently invented writing systems in human history. We know they built sophisticated stone platforms called ahu and created intricate rock art. But we don't know what their social structure looked like, how their economy functioned, or why they stopped making statues sometime in the 1600s. The details of their rise, their flourishing, and their transformation before European contact remain largely mysterious. And Easter Island isn't unique. Take Nan Madol. If you haven't heard of it, don't worry. Most people haven't. It's located on the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, and it's one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the Pacific, maybe the world. Nan Madol is sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific. It's a complex of artificial islands built on a coral reef lagoon. We're talking about 92 artificial islands constructed from massive basalt columns and coral fill, connected by a network of canals. The whole complex covers over 200 acres. Some of the basalt columns used in construction weigh up to 50 tons. And all of this was built without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When was it built? We think construction began around 1200 CE and continued until about 1500 CE. Who built it? The Sordlura dynasty, apparently a ruling family that controlled Pohnpei and surrounding islands. Why was it built? Nobody really knows. The traditional explanation is that it was a ceremonial and administrative center, but the sheer scale of construction suggests something more. Some of the artificial islands were clearly residential. Others seem to have been ritual sites. One island contains structures that look like they might have been tombs. The whole complex is oriented according to astronomical alignments that we don't fully understand. And here's what's really weird. When European explorers first encountered Nan Madol in the 1820s, it was already abandoned. The local Pohnpians told the Europeans that the city had been deserted for generations, that nobody lived there anymore. The Swordlower dynasty had fallen centuries earlier, overthrown by a legendary warrior named Isokalek. But the details of what happened, why the city was abandoned, what life was like when it was thriving, all of that was already lost to living memory. Modern archaeology at Nan Madol has been limited. It's remote, difficult to access, and the site is deteriorating. Rising sea levels are threatening the structures, but even in its ruined state, Nan Madol raises profound questions. How did a relatively small island society mobilize the labor to build such a massive complex? Where did the engineering knowledge come from? And what happened to make them abandon it? These kinds of mysteries repeat across the Pacific. On Fiji, there are massive hill forts that speak to periods of intensive warfare we know almost nothing about. On Tonga, there are enormous stone structures called langi that were royal tombs, but we don't know much about the dynasties that built them. On Samoa, there are star mounds whose purpose remains debated. And then there's the mystery that really challenges our understanding of Pacific history, the sweet potato. The sweet potato is a South American plant. It originated in the Andes. But when Europeans arrived in Polynesia, they found sweet potatoes already being grown across the Pacific from Hawaii to New Zealand. The Polynesian word for sweet potato, kumara, is remarkably similar to words for the plant in several South American languages, which means somehow there was contact between Polynesia and South America before European contact. Polynesians either reached South America, or South Americans reached Polynesia, or both. Recent DNA evidence has confirmed this. Studies of modern Polynesian populations show small amounts of Native American ancestry, so contact definitely happened. But we have no historical record of it, no archaeological evidence of South American settlements in Polynesia or Polynesian settlements in South America, just the sweet potato, some linguistic similarities, and genetic traces. Did Polynesian voyagers reach South America, spend time there, and return with sweet potatoes and perhaps a few South American companions? Did South American mariners, perhaps from the sophisticated seafaring cultures of coastal Peru, venture west and reach Polynesian islands? We don't know. Both seem almost impossibly difficult, but we know one or both happened. This is what's so frustrating about Pacific history. We know that extraordinary things happened. We can see the evidence, but we don't know the details. We don't know the stories of the people involved, and much of what we've lost will never recover. Unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia, where dry climates preserved written records, the humid tropical climate of most Pacific islands destroys organic materials quickly. There are no ancient Polynesian texts to discover, no lost libraries. What existed was oral tradition, stories and genealogies, and navigational instructions passed down through generations. Some of this survived into the modern era and has been recorded, but much was lost in the catastrophic population collapses that followed European contact. Diseases like measles, smallpox, and influenza devastated Pacific island populations. Some islands lost 90% or more of their people within a generation of European contact. When you lose that many people that quickly, you lose knowledge holders, you lose the elders who remember the old stories, the navigators who know the traditional routes, the priests who understand the religious traditions. You lose centuries of accumulated wisdom in a single generation. Recent DNA studies are revealing just how much we missed. Genetic analysis of modern Pacific populations has uncovered evidence of migration patterns that don't match traditional theories. There seem to have been multiple waves of settlement, not just one. Some island populations show genetic contributions from groups we didn't know reached the Pacific. There are hints in the DNA of connections we never suspected, of journeys we never imagined. Linguistic studies are revealing similar complexities. Pacific languages form some of the most diverse language families on Earth, and the relationships between them tell stories of population movements, cultural exchanges and isolations that we're only beginning to understand. Every few years, a new study reveals a connection nobody expected or questions an assumption that seemed certain. What emerges from all this research is a picture of the Pacific as a place of constant movement, innovation, and cultural exchange. Not isolated islands, but a vast network of maritime highways connecting thousands of communities across the world's largest ocean, a network that functioned for over 1,000 years before European contact disrupted it forever. But the details, the individual stories of discovery and settlement, of rise and fall, of innovation and adaptation, most of that is gone. We're left looking at ruins and artifacts, at genetic signatures and linguistic traces, trying to reconstruct a history that was already fading into legend when the first Europeans arrived. The Pacific's forgotten voyagers accomplished something that rivals anything in human history. They explored and settled the largest ocean on Earth, using technology that seems primitive by modern standards, but represented the cutting edge of maritime innovation in its time. They developed navigation techniques sophisticated enough to cross thousands of miles of open ocean and reliably locate islands smaller than Manhattan. They created diverse and complex societies on some of the most remote and challenging environments on the planet, and we barely know their story. That's the gap. That's what we've lost. Picture yourself standing in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's 2550 BCE. You're watching thousands of workers moving massive limestone blocks with precision that seems impossible for the time. Engineers are calculating angles with stunning accuracy. Scribes are recording everything in elegant hieroglyphics. The entire operation runs like a well-oiled machine, coordinated across multiple construction sites, fed by a sophisticated agricultural system, managed by a complex bureaucracy that extends up and down the Nile. Now here's the thing that should make you pause. This pyramid, this incredible achievement of human engineering, it's not the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It's not even close. By the time the Great Pyramid was built, Egypt had already been a unified kingdom for over 400 years. The Egyptians who built it were looking back on their own ancient history, studying monuments their ancestors had constructed, reading texts that were already old. But if you try to trace Egyptian civilization backward, before the pyramids, before the unified kingdom, you hit something strange. A gap, not a complete absence of evidence, but something almost more puzzling. A transition so rapid it seems to violate everything we know about how civilizations develop. Around 3100 BCE, Egypt explodes onto the historical stage as a fully formed complex society. Monumental architecture begins. A sophisticated religious system emerges. Centralized government coalesces under the first pharaohs. All of this happening in what seems like the blink of an eye, historically speaking. Before that, scattered agricultural villages, simple pottery, basic tools, the kind of Neolithic culture you'd find in dozens of places around the ancient world. Nothing that obviously leads to pyramids and hieroglyphics. It's like watching someone go from elementary arithmetic to calculus in a single semester. The progression doesn't make sense. Something's missing. Archaeologists call the period before dynastic Egypt the pre-dynastic era, and they've divided it into neat phases with names like Nakada 1-3. But these labels hide more than they reveal, because what we're really looking at is one of the most puzzling transformations in human history, compressed into just a few centuries. Let's start with what we know for certain. Around 5500 BCE, people started settling along the Nile in permanent villages. They grew wheat and barley, herded cattle and goats, made simple pottery decorated with geometric patterns. These were successful communities, but there's nothing about them that screams future superpower. They're just Neolithic farmers doing what Neolithic farmers did everywhere. By 3100 BCE, someone named Narmer, also called Menes, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. He's wearing the double crown, wielding the power of life and death over millions of people. His scribes are recording his deeds in fully developed hieroglyphic writing. His architects are building massive mud brick structures that require coordinating thousands of workers. His priests are performing elaborate religious ceremonies in temples dedicated to a complex pantheon of gods. That's 2,400 years of development, sure, but most of the really dramatic changes happen in the last 400 years, between about 3,500 and 3,100 BCE. And even then, the archaeological record makes it look like sudden jumps rather than smooth progression. Hieroglyphic writing is the perfect example. The earliest writing systems we know about, like Sumerian cuneiform, you can trace them developing over centuries. Simple pictographs becoming more abstract, accounting marks evolving into phonetic symbols. You can literally watch writing invent itself step by step. Egyptian hieroglyphics don't work like that. The earliest examples we have are already sophisticated. They're using phonetic elements, ideograms, and determinatives in complex combinations. It's not primitive writing figuring itself out. It's a mature system that appears almost fully formed around 3,200 BCE. Some researchers think this means the Egyptians must have been developing writing earlier, but we just haven't found the evidence yet. Others point out that maybe the Egyptians got the idea of writing from Mesopotamia, where it appeared slightly earlier, but then rapidly developed their own completely different system. Both explanations have problems. If writing was developing earlier, where are the clumsy first attempts? Why don't we find practice inscriptions, experimental symbols, the inevitable mistakes that come with inventing something new? And if they borrowed the concept from Mesopotamia, why is Egyptian writing so completely different in form and structure? Why not more obvious parallels in the early stages? The architecture raises similar questions. The first pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, was built around 2650 BCE for the pharaoh Djoser. It's not a rough first attempt. It's a sophisticated structure showing advanced understanding of engineering, mathematics, and stonework. The architect Imhotep didn't just stack stones. He created a complex with multiple levels, underground chambers, elaborate decorative elements. But here's what's strange. The Step Pyramid appears less than 500 years after the unification of Egypt. Before that, Egyptian architecture was mostly mud brick. The jump from mud brick buildings to massive stone pyramids is enormous, not just in scale, but in the entire knowledge base required. You need to know how to quarry stone in massive blocks, how to transport those blocks, some weighing multiple tons across considerable distances, how to cut and fit them with precision, how to design structures that won't collapse under their own weight, how to organize and feed the workforce, how to maintain quality control across years or decades of construction. That's a lot of knowledge to develop in a few centuries. And the archaeological evidence for the intermediate steps is surprisingly thin. Some researchers have proposed that maybe there was an earlier sophisticated culture, something we're calling Dynasty Zero or the Pre-Dynastic period, that laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The evidence for this comes from a handful of shadowy figures who appear in fragments of king lists and on scattered artifacts. The most famous is the Scorpion King, known from a ceremonial mace head found at Hierakonpolis. The mace head shows a ruler wearing what looks like an early version of the white crown of Upper Egypt, performing some kind of ritual. He's labeled with a scorpion symbol, but we don't know his real name, when exactly he ruled, or what he accomplished. Was he a real king who helped unify Egypt before Narmer? Was he a local chieftain, whose importance got exaggerated by later tradition? Was he a mythological figure who never existed at all? We don't know, the evidence is too fragmentary, but his existence, even as a possibility, suggests there might have been a more gradual development of Egyptian kingship than the sudden appearance of Narmer would suggest. Maybe the unification wasn't a single dramatic event, but the culmination of generations of political consolidation that we can barely see in the archaeological record. Then there's Nabta Playa, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Nabta Playa is a dried lake bed in the Nubian desert, about 500 miles south of Cairo. Today it's completely inhospitable, one of the driest places on Earth. But between about 7000 and 3000 BCE, when the Sahara was greener and wetter, Nabta Playa was an oasis, a place where seasonal lakes formed during the monsoon rains. People gathered there, and they built something extraordinary. Around 5000 BCE, possibly earlier, someone arranged large stone slabs in a circular pattern at Nabta Playa, not randomly, not as simple markers. These stones are aligned to astronomical events. Some researchers argue they track the summer solstice. Others suggest more complex astronomical relationships. The structure includes stone alignments that might have served as a primitive calendar, helping people predict the arrival of the monsoon rains. There are buried stones arranged in patterns that some researchers think might represent constellations. The whole complex suggests a level of astronomical knowledge and organizational capacity that shouldn't exist among small groups of Neolithic herders. Now, the interpretations of Nabta Playa are controversial. Some archaeologists think the astronomical alignments are overstated, that people are finding patterns that aren't really there. Others argue the structure is proof that the people of the Sahara were developing sophisticated knowledge systems thousands of years before dynastic Egypt emerged. But regardless of the specific interpretations, Nabta Playa tells us something important. The people living in what's now the Sahara Desert, before it dried out completely, they weren't simple nomads waiting for civilization to happen. They were observing the sky, tracking celestial patterns, organizing communal labor for large construction projects, developing cosmological ideas complex enough to encode in stone. And here's the critical connection. Around 3500 BCE, when the Sahara underwent its final desiccation, turning from savanna to desert, these people had to move. The climate was changing, the seasonal rains were failing, the lakes were drying up, the grasslands were turning to sand. They had two choices, die or migrate, and the nearest place with reliable water was the Nile Valley. So what if the sudden sophistication of late pre-dynastic Egypt wasn't really sudden at all? What if it represents the arrival of people who'd been developing complex societies elsewhere, in regions that are now so arid and inhospitable that we've barely explored them archaeologically? What if the skills that built the pyramids, the knowledge that created hieroglyphics, the astronomical understanding that aligned temples and monuments, what if all of that was developed in the Green Sahara by people whose settlements are now buried under hundreds of feet of sand? The climate evidence supports this scenario. The final desiccation of the Sahara happened in pulses between about 5000 and 3000 BCE, with the most severe phase occurring right before the emergence of dynastic Egypt, exactly when you'd expect large-scale migration into the Nile Valley. The genetic evidence is more ambiguous but intriguing. Studies of ancient and modern Egyptian DNA show influences from across North and East Africa, suggesting multiple population movements converging on the Nile. The people who built dynastic Egypt weren't a single homogeneous group, but a mixture of populations with different origins, and the cultural evidence. The religious system of ancient Egypt includes elements that seem to reference a homeland somewhere in the south and west, the direction of the now desert Sahara. Some of the oldest Egyptian myths talk about the primordial mound emerging from the waters of chaos, which sounds a lot like watching islands of land appear in seasonal lakes during times of drought. But here's what makes this theory both compelling and frustrating. If there was a sophisticated Saharan culture that migrated to Egypt and jump-started civilization there, we're probably never going to find direct proof. The Sahara is enormous, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Archaeological survey is extremely difficult, and any settlements that existed would be buried under centuries of sand, scattered by wind, destroyed by the extreme temperature fluctuations that have been grinding away at the landscape for 5,000 years. We might be looking at one of those historical gaps that can never be completely filled, a lost chapter that we know must exist because the story doesn't make sense without it, but which remains tantalizingly out of reach. What we're left with is this. Egyptian civilization didn't appear from nowhere. That's not how human societies work. People don't just spontaneously invent writing and architecture and complex government. These things have to develop, which means there must be a developmental period somewhere. We can see part of that development in the archaeological record of pre-dynastic Egypt, but it's not enough. There are too many gaps, too many sudden jumps, too many skills that seem to appear without the expected learning curve. Something else happened. Maybe multiple somethings. Maybe migrations we can't trace. Maybe knowledge exchange with other early civilizations. Maybe lost traditions developed in places that are now impossible to excavate. Or maybe, just maybe, the people of the ancient Nile Valley were simply more innovative, more adaptive, more capable of rapid cultural evolution than we give them credit for. Maybe when the climate pushed them to develop quickly or die, they chose to develop. And they did it so successfully that we can barely believe it was possible. Either way, when you stand in front of those pyramids, you're looking at the result of a process we don't fully understand. A transition from simple villages to complex civilization that happened faster and more completely than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The pre-dynastic gap remains one of archaeology's most fascinating mysteries. And somewhere buried under the sands of the Sahara, or waiting to be discovered in some unexplored corner of Egypt, the missing pieces of the story are still waiting to be found. Picture this. You're a member of a thriving hunter-gatherer community. 12,900 years ago, your people have been flourishing for millennia. The Ice Age is finally ending. The glaciers have been retreating for 7,000 years. Temperatures are warming, sea levels are rising, and life is getting easier. Your ancestors learned to hunt megafauna, to process wild grains, to build permanent structures. Some of your settlements have hundreds of people. You have trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. You're creating art, practicing astronomy, building monuments. You're on the verge of something big. Maybe agriculture, maybe cities, maybe writing. And then in the span of a single human lifetime, everything goes to hell. The change starts subtly. Colder winters, shorter summers, but within a generation something unprecedented happens. The global climate doesn't just cool, it collapses. Temperatures plummet back to full glacial conditions, not over thousands of years like they should, but over decades. The glaciers that had been retreating for 7,000 years suddenly surge forward again. Forests die, grasslands become tundra. The megafauna you've been hunting for millennia start going extinct, not just in one place, but everywhere. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, all disappearing within a few centuries. Your settlements, the permanent villages your people have been building for generations, they become unsustainable. The food isn't there anymore. The herds are gone. The wild grain fields have failed. People are starving. Some groups try to migrate, looking for refuges that haven't been hit as hard. Others try to adapt, to survive on whatever resources remain. Many fail. The archaeological record from this period shows a dramatic population collapse. Not down to 1,280 people, like the ancient bottleneck, but still catastrophic. Cultures that had been flourishing for thousands of years simply vanish from the record. Their settlements abandoned, their tool traditions discontinued, their knowledge lost. This wasn't a myth. This wasn't speculation. This was the Younger Dryas, and it lasted for 1,300 years. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Before the Younger Dryas, during what archaeologists call the Alert period, humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The evidence from this time suggests societies far more sophisticated than we used to think possible for hunter-gatherers. Take the Natufian culture of the Levant. These people were building permanent stone structures 15,000 years ago, not temporary camps, but year-round villages with mortared walls, plastered floors and storage facilities. They were harvesting wild grains, so systematically, that they developed specialized tools for it. Sickle blades with distinctive silica polish from cutting thousands of grain stalks, grinding stones for processing seeds into flour, storage pits for keeping surplus grain through the winter. They were doing everything agricultural societies do, except actually planting crops. They had achieved sedentary living through intensive foraging, and they weren't alone. In North America, the Clovis culture was thriving. Sophisticated big game hunters with a distinctive stone tool technology that shows up across the entire continent. They weren't random nomadic bands. They were organized, mobile, capable of coordinating large-scale hunts and maintaining technological traditions across thousands of miles. In Europe, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers were creating cave art, so sophisticated it wouldn't be matched for 10,000 years. The paintings at Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, these aren't crude stick figures, they're dynamic, naturalistic depictions of animals, showing knowledge of perspective, motion, anatomy. The people creating this art had leisure time, specialized artists, complex symbolic systems. They had culture in every meaningful sense of the word. Then the younger Dryas hit, and most of it disappeared. But some structures survived, and these structures are forcing us to completely rethink what we thought we knew about civilization. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey. When it was discovered in the 1990s, it broke archaeology. The site is 11,600 years old. That puts it right at the end of the Younger Dryas, before the invention of agriculture, before pottery, before settled civilization as we understand it. But it's not a simple settlement. It's a monumental complex of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, and covered with intricate carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human figures. Building this required coordinating hundreds of workers, quarrying limestone, moving massive blocks without wheels or draft animals, carving detailed reliefs with stone tools. This isn't what hunter-gatherers were supposed to be capable of. According to the old model, you need agriculture first, then surplus food, then specialized labor, then monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe has it backwards. The monuments came first. The people who built it were still hunting gazelles and gathering wild plants. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. Or had they? Because here's the thing. Göbekli Tepe didn't appear out of nowhere. The construction techniques, the symbolic systems, the social organization required to build it. These things take time to develop. Generations at minimum, probably centuries, which means there had to be predecessors. Earlier attempts, simpler structures, a gradual evolution of the skills and knowledge necessary to create something like Göbekli Tepe. But where are they? If they existed before the Younger Dryas, most of the evidence would be buried under 1,300 years of climate catastrophe. Sites abandoned, structures collapsed, organic materials decomposed, and that's just the sites on land. Let's talk about sea levels. At the height of the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. That's a 40-story building worth of water locked up in glaciers. The coastlines looked completely different. What's now underwater continental shelf was dry land. Millions of square miles of habitable territory that humans would have occupied. And here's the thing about coastlines. They're prime real estate, rich in resources, moderate in climate, easy to travel along. If advanced hunter-gatherer societies existed before the Younger Dryas, they would have been concentrated on coastlines. And when the Ice Age ended, when sea levels rose those 400 feet over several thousand years, all those coastal settlements would have been inundated, their structures flooded, their artifacts scattered, their evidence erased. We've lost an entire world beneath the waves. This raises an uncomfortable question. How advanced were these lost coastal cultures? The standard model says they were hunter-gatherers, maybe complex hunter-gatherers, but still fundamentally primitive. But what if they weren't? What if some groups had developed technologies we don't expect? sophisticated astronomy, advanced mathematics, early metallurgy. The knowledge would have been there. These people had the same brain capacity we do. They'd been refining survival skills for hundreds of thousands of years. They had thousands of years of relative stability before the younger Dryas. Why wouldn't they innovate? This is where we enter controversial territory. Some researchers, Graham Hancock most prominently, have proposed that an advanced Ice Age civilization existed before the younger Dryas. Not aliens, not Atlantis, but human. A culture that developed sophisticated technologies, possibly even maritime capabilities, that built monumental structures which mostly got destroyed by the climate catastrophe and subsequent flooding. The evidence they point to includes anomalous megalithic structures worldwide. The massive blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons. The precision stonework at Pumapunku in Bolivia. The underwater structures off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni. The submerged city ruins found off the coast of India, near Dwarka. Mainstream archaeology dismisses most of these as either natural formations misinterpreted as artificial structures, or as much younger than claimed. And they're probably right about most of them. But the dismissal feels a bit too easy sometimes, because we know for certain that sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies existed. Göbekli Tepe proved it. We know that vast territories were submerged by rising sea levels. We know that the younger Dryas caused a catastrophic population collapse that would have destroyed most archaeological evidence. And we know that our ancestors were just as smart as we are. So how can we be sure there wasn't more? Then there's the younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This is the really controversial part. Some scientists have proposed that the sudden onset of the younger Dryas wasn't caused by normal climate fluctuations, but by a cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid breaking up in the atmosphere and exploding over the ice sheets, causing immediate catastrophic cooling. The evidence they cite includes a thin layer of sediment from exactly 12,800 years ago that contains exotic materials, nanodiamonds that only form under extreme temperatures and pressures, magnetic spherules suggesting massive fires, high concentrations of platinum group elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids, shocked quartz crystals showing evidence of impact forces. Mainstream geologists are skeptical. They argue the evidence is ambiguous, that the materials could have other explanations, that no definitive impact crater from the right time period has been found. But the debate continues, because if it happened, if a cosmic impact triggered the younger Dryas, then any advanced societies existing at that time would have been facing a double catastrophe. Immediate destruction from the impact effects, tsunamis, wildfires, atmospheric debris, followed by 1,300 years of climate collapse. That's enough to erase a civilization pretty thoroughly. The extinction data supports something catastrophic. The younger Dryas saw the disappearance of most Ice Age megafauna worldwide. In North America alone, 35 genera of large mammals went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, all gone. Some of these species had survived multiple previous climate fluctuations over millions of years, but they couldn't survive this one, and neither could the Clovis culture. The distinctive Clovis tool technology disappears from the archaeological record right at the beginning of the younger Dryas. The people didn't go extinct, but their culture did. Whatever social structure and knowledge system had allowed them to spread across an entire continent, it collapsed. This pattern repeats worldwide. Sophisticated cultures existing before 12,800 years ago, then a gap in the archaeological record, then simpler cultures reappearing after the younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago. It's like a reset button got pushed on human cultural evolution. Not complete extinction, but severe enough disruption that much of the accumulated knowledge and social complexity got lost. When civilization started building back up after the younger Dryas, people had to relearn things their ancestors might have already figured out. and some knowledge might have been lost entirely. This represents humanity's largest historical blind spot. We have decent archaeological evidence going back about 10,000 years to the beginning of settled agriculture and the first cities. Before that, the record gets increasingly fragmentary, and the younger Dryas is right at the break point. Everything before it is harder to find, harder to interpret, more likely to have been destroyed. We're trying to understand human history with a 1-300-year catastrophe sitting right in the middle of the most interesting period. It's like trying to read a book where someone ripped out 100 pages right at the climax. What did we lose? Maybe nothing more than hunter-gatherer camps and simple tool traditions. Or maybe something more. Knowledge of astronomy developed over thousands of years of observation. Mathematical systems sophisticated enough to predict seasons and track celestial events. Oral histories preserving information about human migrations and environmental changes. Possibly even early forms of writing or symbolic notation that didn't survive in the archaeological record. We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence is buried under sediment, drowned beneath rising seas, destroyed by 1,300 years of climate catastrophe. But the gaps remain, and in those gaps there's room for questions that make mainstream archaeologists uncomfortable. Because here's what we do know. Our ancestors weren't primitive. They were smart, adaptive, capable of sophisticated cultural achievements even without agriculture or cities. They survived the younger Dryas, rebuilt their societies, and eventually created the civilizations we know about. But what they created before, what they might have known and lost, that remains hidden in the largest gap in human history. And sometimes the questions we can't answer are more interesting than the ones we can. The younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago. The glaciers retreated again, temperatures warmed, and within a few thousand years, the first true civilizations appeared. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. But they didn't start from nothing. They built on knowledge and techniques that must have been developing for millennia. And some of that knowledge might have been very old indeed, preserved through the catastrophe, passed down through generations, waiting for stable enough conditions to flourish again. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of cultures that endured the worst climate disaster of the last 100,000 years, and all inheritors of whatever they managed to preserve through the darkness. So here we are at the end of our journey through the gaps, the dark spaces, the lost centuries that riddle human history like holes in ancient parchment. And you know what? We haven't actually solved anything. The Bronze Age collapse is still a mystery. We still don't know what happened to the Indus Valley people. The Dark Ages remain frustratingly dark. Pre-Columbian America keeps most of its secrets. And those Pacific Voyagers, they're still out there somewhere in the historical fog. Their stories waiting to be discovered. But here's the thing about mysteries. They don't need to be solved to be valuable. In fact, there's something profoundly important about acknowledging what we don't know, because every gap in our understanding is an invitation, a reminder that history isn't a closed book. It's an ongoing investigation where every generation gets to participate in the discovery. Think about it this way. Every person who's ever told you they know exactly what happened in the past is lying. Not maliciously, necessarily, but they're filling in the gaps with assumptions, with guesses dressed up as certainty. The honest approach, the scientific approach, is to say we don't know yet. And that yet is doing a lot of work, because we're getting better at this all the time. Technologies that didn't exist 20 years ago are revolutionizing archaeology right now. Ground-penetrating radar that can map entire buried cities without disturbing a single stone. DNA analysis that can track ancient migrations with precision our predecessors couldn't have imagined. Satellite imagery that reveals landscape modifications invisible from the ground. Climate proxies that reconstruct ancient weather patterns season by season. Each new tool illuminates another corner of the darkness. Just in the last few years, we've discovered entire civilizations that nobody knew existed. The LIDAR surveys in the Amazon revealed massive settlements where scholars had assumed only scattered tribes lived. Deep-sea exploration found shipwrecks that rewrote our understanding of ancient trade networks. Ice core analysis pushed back the dates for human activity in the Americas by thousands of years. Every single one of these discoveries required rewriting the textbooks, admitting that what we thought we knew was incomplete. And that's going to keep happening. Someone listening to this right now, maybe you, might be the one who makes the next big discovery. Not necessarily by finding some lost artifact in a dramatic excavation. Maybe by asking a question nobody else thought to ask. Maybe by applying a new technology to an old problem. Maybe by looking at familiar evidence from an unfamiliar angle and seeing patterns everyone else missed. Because the gaps aren't obstacles, they're opportunities. Every blank space in the historical record is a chance for future researchers to make their mark. Every unsolved mystery is a puzzle waiting for someone clever enough, patient enough, curious enough to piece it together. The lost epochs aren't lost forever. They're just lost for now. And there's something comforting about that, isn't there? In a world that often feels completely mapped, totally explored, with no frontiers left to discover, history reminds us that mystery still exists. That wonder is still possible. That we're still at the beginning of understanding our own story as a species. We've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and we've only figured out tiny fragments of our own past. The rest is waiting. So what should you take away from all this? Maybe just the reminder that certainty is overrated. That the most interesting questions are the ones we can't answer yet. That every generation stands on the shoulders of the previous one, seeing a little further into the darkness. And that your role in this ongoing investigation matters. Whether you're a professional archaeologist, or just someone who finds this stuff fascinating at 2 a.m., your curiosity contributes to the collective effort to understand where we came from.